phrase?
Oh gosh, it's like preschool all over again.
So many ways.
In so very many ways. Yeah, and actually on some level I think that this is going to be sort of the preschool level introduction to the Sacrament of Holy Orders. I really do want to keep it on a fairly basic level. So, as many of you know, for the last few years at Conclave, I do a short talk on one of the sacraments, and the one that we've selected for this conclave is Holy Orders. And this is, I think, one of the least understood of the sacraments in traditional Christianity. I think that people who grew up in Orthodox communions or in the Catholic Church or in the Anglican communion, baptism makes sense, confirmation makes sense, the Eucharist makes sense, penance makes sense, but Holy Orders are a bit of a mystery. And that is perhaps less true in some of the initiate churches that grew out of the esoteric movement, because in many cases those in Holy Orders vastly outnumbered the laity. And there were, in many cases, churches that were composed entirely of people in Holy Orders. And there's actually a good reason for that, especially if we're talking about a Gnostic church. Gnosticism, well, it's not a spectator sport. That if you are committed to the principles of Gnostic practice, then you're making a commitment to doing a certain kind of work, and often that translates into a commitment to taking Holy Orders. But in the AJC, we are, I think, a little bit more oriented towards the traditional model, where you have those in orders and you have laity, and the laity play a very, very important role in the development of the church. And the fact that one is not in Holy Orders doesn't mean that one isn't doing important work. But nonetheless, Holy Orders are an important element in the tradition of practical Christianity. I want to start with the terminology, because the idea of Holy Orders, I think, is easy to misunderstand. Often some people think of it in terms of receiving a command. But that's not what the term order means in this case, but rather it refers to admission to an ordo, to an order in the sense that we as esotericists use that term, talking about fraternal orders and orders of knighthood and things like that. So to take Holy Orders is, by its very nature, an initiatory practice. Now, as I referred to in my talk yesterday, René Guénon insists that Christianity once had an esoteric and initiatic character, and that initiatic character has over time been lost. Nonetheless, there are initiatic elements that are preserved within the sacraments, within the mysteries. And certainly baptism is the most important of these initiatic sacraments. But in terms of the sort of esoteric practice of admission to an order, Holy Orders really stands alone. And so on some level, I think it makes more sense to us to think of it in those terms from an esoteric standpoint. There are, of course, the three primary orders, that of deacons, priests, and bishops. And I'm not going to go into so much the minor orders. I'm not going to look at things like subdeacons and archdeacons and archpriests, and it can get sort of infinitely multiplied. So I want to focus just on those three and the nature of that ordination. As His Eminence is fond of pointing out, the order of priests actually postdates that of the deacons and the bishops. That originally the sacramental action of the church was effected through the bishop, and the bishop was the one who conducted the liturgy and confected the Eucharist. And then the deacons would administer that to the faithful at a further distance. And as the church began to grow, it became obvious that this system wasn't ultimately going to work. And so the order of priesthood was instituted as an intermediary between the bishop and the people. Not in the sense that the priest would be a sort of gatekeeper to the mysteries, but rather a facilitator of them, being able to bring them to the people. If we look at the different powers and possibilities of the three orders, we start looking at the order of the deacon. The deacon can baptize. In fact, as an extraordinary minister, anybody can baptize. And in the Catholic Church, deacons can sometimes witness marriages as well. The deacon's job is primarily to read the gospel and to assist the priest at the liturgy. The priest preaches, although in some cases in the AJC this pertains also to the order of the deacon, can confect the Eucharist. Obviously this is one of the most important elements of the priestly order. Can administer penance, can administer the Sacrament of Reconciliation, and anoint the sick, although this in extremis also pertains to the office of the deacon. The bishop is the vessel of the sacred tradition and a vessel of grace. It is how the Holy Spirit flows through to the faithful. And the sacramental power of the bishop is the fullness of holy orders. They can ordain priests and deacons. They can consecrate other bishops. And in the Western churches, they can confirm. So the sort of division of labor is fairly clearly marked out. And while in the AJC, sometimes there's a little bit more wiggle room than there is in some of the other mainstream churches, we stick fairly close to the traditional practice of dividing up those different powers. In terms of the ritual practice, the laying on of hands, of karutonia, the imposition of hands with prayer, is really the most important aspect of the transmission of powers that comes through holy orders. Chrismation, that is to say the anointing with oil, actually mirrors apostolic succession in many ways. We are now at the time of Pentecost, of course, isn't it? And we know that at the Pentecost, the apostles were surmounted by a tongue of flame. And often this is seen as mirrored in the act of chrismation. Oil is associated with fire. Chrismation is, in the Eastern tradition, considered to be equivalent to the laying on of hands. Now, in terms of the actual ritual practice of being admitted into the holy orders, I'm actually going to go now backwards from the bishop back to the deacons. The bishop is ordained or consecrated by or with the consent of several bishops. Now, this has always been a matter of some dispute. How many bishops do we need in order to consecrate a bishop? Within the mainstream churches, generally the number is 3. But the primary argument for that is that we want to make sure that the apostolic succession is preserved. And so that if there is a break in the apostolic chain for one of the consecrating bishops, that will probably be made up for with one of the other 2. So it really just is a kind of safeguard or fail-safe. But there are also good arguments that there is a representation of the will of the community in having more than one bishop lay hands on a consecrated bishop. Although, interestingly, if we look at apostolic succession as reaching back to the original apostles, of course, these original apostles didn't gather together 3 apostles in order to consecrate a bishop. That consecration was handed hand to hand, one person to another. And so I think it would be ultimately hard to argue that an episcopal consecration that's done with a single bishop would somehow be invalid, because that would seem to invalidate the very origin of the line. Nonetheless, for ensuring succession, it's important that we have, at the very least, the witnessing of other bishops for the consecration. A bishop may only be consecrated by another bishop. And there is a very, very strange exception to this that isn't really an exception. And I've had some difficulty tracking it down, and I mention it more for curiosity's sake than anything else. But there is in the Alexandrian Church a tradition that the patriarch was constantly surrounded by 12 priests. And if the patriarch died, those priests would consecrate one of their number to be the successor as patriarch. Now that's really interesting because it bypasses, in some sense, the other bishops of the church. And I speculate, and this is nothing more than speculation, I speculate that this is simply a matter of logistics, that this is simply a matter of making sure that there isn't a massive gap or interregnum in the Alexandrian Patriarchate, because you would have to essentially summon all of the bishops, or at least some of them from oftentimes long distances, in order to consecrate a new bishop. But this doesn't seem to create any kind of precedent where if you've got 12 priests together, you can consecrate a bishop. Interestingly, in the Eastern tradition, at the liturgy in which a bishop is consecrated, he would normally also ordain a priest and a deacon in that very liturgy, which there's something that I only discovered in my research for this presentation, but I found that just absolutely fascinating. Talk about being thrown right into the fire. I mean, you are called upon in the liturgy in which you are consecrated as a bishop to exercise some of the most important powers of the bishopric right then and there. To be sure, of course, given the strictures that we place on ordination, as many of you know, requirements for ordination to the diaconate and to the priesthood are fairly stringent in the AJC. And so we don't have the large number of ordinands that a larger communion, say, in the Orthodox churches might have. And so we don't observe that practice. The priest serves at the pleasure of the bishop and acts as his or her representative. Of course, I use this terminology of his or her, which is in some ways particular to the AJC and other churches that now administer holy orders to women as well as to men. In many cases, the holy orders were restricted entirely to men. We see that in the Catholic Church. There is no ordination for women. But in the Orthodox churches, there is the long tradition of the female permanent diaconate that was within the last, I think, 15 years restored in the Orthodox churches, where there's the female permanent diaconate. But there is no female priesthood or female bishopric. In the AJC, coming directly from our statement of principles, in particular the ninth principle, we offer ordination to everyone who is qualified to do so without any regard for gender, for orientation, for anything like that. So I am going to try to use the gender-neutral language when talking about our orders, because that is particularly appropriate for us. So, as I said, the priest acts as the bishop's representative. And a priest can be ordained by a single bishop without any concern for validity or legitimacy. The deacon, in turn, serves the priest. and the deacon also is ordained by the bishop. And as I mentioned, that office of the diaconate is older than the priesthood itself. Often what is focused on in holy orders, and I think rightly so, is the way in which the mysteries are administered, or the sacraments. And so I want to just run down very, very quickly the sort of basic guidelines that we have for who is able to act as the ordinary and extraordinary minister for each of the sacraments. And I go through this for one primary reason, which is I can never remember them without notes, and so now I'm going to have it on video, and I can just always refer to that and make sure that I'm right. And if I goof up, His Eminence is sitting in the front row, quick to correct me, I'm sure.
That's why I'm in the front row.
Those of you who are in the seminary and are doing your papers on the sacraments, on the mysteries, a lot of this will be very, very familiar because the ordinary and extraordinary minister in each case is very, very important. For the sacrament of baptism, the ordinary minister is the priest. This does seem to pertain particularly to the priest, which makes sense from an initiatic standpoint. An initiation can only be given by somebody who already possesses that initiation. And so I think that this goes to Guénon's point that if in fact baptism had preserved its esoteric and initiatic quality complete, then it could only be confected by, at the very least, somebody who had been validly baptized, and very likely even the priest or maybe even the bishop. But the extraordinary minister, that is to say, the valid, though sometimes unusual, agent of the sacrament of baptism is, in fact, anyone at all. Anyone who baptizes, and you can refer to my talk about the sacrament of baptism, anyone who baptizes in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit with flowing water, that is to say, water that moves, that baptism is considered to be valid. So that is not purely a function of holy orders. The Eucharist, on the other hand, can only be confected by the priest. So that, I think, is an important gesture toward the initiatic line that's passed through in what we call apostolic succession. There is no extraordinary minister for the Eucharist. There is no circumstance in which somebody who is not a validly ordained priest can legitimately confect the Eucharist. That is something that pertains very specifically to that order. And given the centrality of the Eucharist for sacramental worship in both mainstream and independent churches, you can see that the order of the priest becomes vitally, vitally important. That if that were missing, if we did not have that succession, then there could be no Eucharist. So it's vitally important that we make sure that the hand-to-hand succession from the apostolic powers is preserved. The sacrament of confirmation involves chrismation, and chrismation does seem to be something that does pertain specifically to holy orders. That holy orders seems to connect one to the initiatic chain in such a way that one can then administer that kind of chrismation, which, as we said before, is equivalent in the Eastern churches to the laying on of hands. And so confirmation pertains particularly to the office of the bishop. Though in certain extraordinary cases that power can be delegated usually to an archpriest, although ultimately that could be delegated even to a priest. And there is precedent for that within the Catholic and the Orthodox communions as well. When we have a church that is as far-flung as the AJC is, where there's often hundreds of miles, if not more, intervening between the laity in a particular parish and their parish priest, and even more so the bishop, this becomes very, very important. I'm hoping that at some time in the future, somebody will be watching this video and say, well, I don't understand what they're talking about. There's an AJC parish on every block in the United States. And so, this doesn't quite make sense, but we're not there yet. The sacrament of confession, or penance or reconciliation, again, like the Eucharist, has to be administered through the priest. That in the ordination to the priesthood, as many of you saw just the other day with the ordination of our good friend and brother John DiGilio, it pertains to the office of the priest to bind and loose. Those sins that you will forgive, they are forgiven, and those sins you retain, they are retained. That is an extraordinary kind of power, and that does seem to pertain particularly to the order of the priesthood as a succession from the apostles. So again, there is no extraordinary minister there. That is a unique power to the priesthood. The same is true of unction, or the extreme unction, blessing the sick. I mean, we use many of those terms somewhat interchangeably. That is something that has to be administered by somebody in the priestly order. There is no extraordinary minister for that, which is, I think, for many of us, somewhat disconcerting, because when we're talking about the necessity to provide a sacrament in an extreme case, there are fewer, more extreme cases than somebody who's literally dying. Your Eminence.
Oh, I was just going to note, because you made a reference at the beginning about extreme unction and deacons, but that's not the case here. I was just going to add the reason why, and this always stumps. I find this is the biggest stumper for seminarians, so I guess I'm saving myself some heartache later.
This is one paper we won't have to correct anymore.
But we probably still will. But the reason why is that even though unction involves the administration of oil, is that if you look, when seconds count, and if you look at the extreme version of unction where somebody is about to pass, one of the essential elements to administering the sacrament is the forgiveness of sins, which only a priest can pronounce.
Yes, and
if it wasn't for that, a deacon could administer.
Right, yeah, that there is a sort of included in that rite the forgiveness of sins, the loosing of them from their sins, and that pertains very specifically to the priest.
And there's a scriptural reference for that as well, as you notice many times in the canonical Gospels. When Christ heals somebody, he says, "Thy sins be forgiven thee." It's always a package deal.
And that's, of course, associated with the idea that is present in many cultures, that illness is the result of some kind of wrongdoing. Now, of course, we don't hold to that kind of idea that somehow if you're sick, it's because you've made some mistake. But I think we do have to take into account the fact that whether we're sick or well, we are in need of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And so the assumption that we need that forgiveness at the time of our deaths is a very, very reasonable one. The sacrament of marriage, of course, this is another stumper for a lot of our seminarians, because the ordinary minister is, of course, the couple itself. That it's not a sacrament that is confected by the priest or by some other minister in the way that the others are. But it is witnessed and sanctified by the actions of the priest. And so the priest is the ordinary minister, for marriage, the sacrament of matrimony, although the deacon can also sanctify those marriages. Which leaves, of course, the Sacrament of Holy Orders itself. And the Sacrament of Holy Orders pertains specifically to the bishop. And this is the only one that cannot be delegated. That this is something that pertains specifically to the order of the bishop. And so you see that each of these orders, and I do want to really stick to that idea of that the diaconate is an order unto itself. That the priesthood is an order. It is a community. It is a body of initiates in this way, even setting aside this idea that the esoteric or initiatic character may have been lost. This is a body of those who have undergone an initiation, who have undergone an experience that transforms them in some fundamental way. That the bishops are an order unto themselves. That there really is something unique that pertains to each one. One of the things that we can see is that there are powers that are delegated to each one that are unique to each order. There are things that the deacons can do that the laity cannot do. There are things that priests can do that deacons absolutely cannot do. And there are things that bishops do that priests absolutely cannot do. And this is why we say that the episcopacy is the fullness of the Sacrament of Holy Orders. In the sacramental churches, there is no rank in orders above that of bishop. And often people who are looking at, say, the Catholic Church say, well, wait a second, there's all these ranks. There's archbishops, and we have archbishops in the AJC as well. You have the College of Cardinals, you have the Holy Father, you have the terminology of the patriarchs in Lisbon and Milan, as well as
Venice.
Venice.
Yeah.
Venice. So it seems that there are these additional ranks. But those of you who are familiar with the operations of Freemasonry will see immediately a parallel to this, that there is no rank in Freemasonry, there is no degree in Freemasonry higher than that of the Master Mason. And all of those other degrees are merely pendants to the degree of Master Mason. And so these other offices are merely specific functions that are fulfilled by bishops within the church, that there's not something that's higher. So the different orders all have different functions and different powers. And it's very, very important to understand the way in which those are distributed. And of course, that power comes primarily from the line of apostolic succession. Now, I have to admit that ever since I was quite young, I was fascinated by the idea of apostolic succession. Because for me, religion is, in a very real way, primarily about connecting ourselves with something greater than ourselves. It's connecting ourselves with God and with a community. A community not just of the faithful sitting around in a room, but the community of those who were and those who will be. To connect ourselves into a temporal line that is greater than ourselves. To connect back to a history, into a future. And for me, the idea of apostolic succession is of vital importance in that connection. That's how that chain happens. And so it probably is absolutely no surprise at all that I would find myself in a communion in a jurisdiction that holds initiatic elements of succession to be so important. You'll often hear in talking about the independent churches the idea that the episcopal consecrations are valid but illicit. And this is a terminology that gets thrown around a lot, especially in contexts where we have the so-called wandering bishops. And so I wanted to make just a brief comment about that distinction. Validity has to do with the transmission of the initiatic chain. Whether this is done according to the practices that have been observed since the time of apostolic Christianity. And we often refer to those as canonical practices. Although that's a bit of a misnomer, of course, because each church has its own canons and the way that things are done lawfully, and that has to do more with licitness than with validity. But when we look at validity, we're talking about the transmission of the initiatic power from one person to another. When we talk about licitness, we're talking about doing so in conformity with the particular lawful practices as defined by specific human organized churches. And that's a very, very different thing. So for example, if we look at the Catholic Church, no consecration of a bishop is considered licit or lawful without the consent of the Holy Father. That's it. You can't do an end run around the Pope. Right? But those consecrations would nonetheless still be valid. You'll find yourself excommunicated faster than you can blink, but quite literally, because that involves what's called a late sententia excommunication, which means it happens with the act. So at the moment you do it, you are already excommunicated. But that's a matter of licitness. That's a matter of conforming to the regulations that have been imposed by the Catholic Church for its own purposes. Which is to say that if a Catholic bishop, without the consent of the Pope, and there's lots of history for this, you can do your Google searches on your own, if a Catholic bishop, without the consent of the Holy Father, consecrates another bishop, that is valid, because it pertains to the office of the bishop to consecrate. But it is not licit, which means that that consecrated bishop, and in fact the consecrating bishop, cease, or in the case of the one consecrated, never become Catholic bishops. And that's an interesting distinction. Now, at one time, that was an absurd distinction. Before the schism, by which I mean the primary break between East and West, there was only the Catholic Church. It was the only game in town. And so to not be a Catholic bishop was equivalent to not being a bishop. But with the diffusion of the sacramental churches, that's no longer the case. And so this would be true within the context of the Apostolic Johannite Church as well. If I were to go off and consecrate a bishop, that person would be a bishop. That is absolutely valid. But they would not be an AJC bishop. They would have no power within the church because it would be done in contravention to the canon law of the AJC. So this distinction, which I think historically at one time would have made very little sense, now becomes very, very important because it does differentiate between the transhuman or superhuman power that is transmitted in the apostolic succession and the purely human laws that are laid down as a matter of, more than anything else, and forgive the sort of vulgarity of the term, quality control. So when we talk about our episcopal lineages, from the point of view of the Catholic Church, and that's an important point, whenever you're talking about licitness, you always have to make sure you know what law you're talking about. So from the point of view of the Catholic Church, the consecrations of the Apostolic Johannite Church, of the EG, of other independent sacramental churches, independent Catholic churches, are valid in most cases, but they are illicit. They are done in contravention to the law. So you do not, if you were to be consecrated for the AJC, you don't become a Catholic bishop. So it's an important sort of distinction. Now, what actually constitutes the sort of canon validity and the particular licitness of a particular act is open to considerable debate. For example, from the Catholic perspective, the consecration of a woman to the order of the episcopate is not merely illicit, but also invalid. because it's in contravention to the way that it was practiced through most of historical Christianity. Clearly, we don't consider that to be the case. And a consecration of a woman to the sacred order of the episcopate within the AJC would be both valid from our perspectives and also for our own purposes, everything else being equal, licit. It would be in keeping with our canon laws. So,
and additionally celebratory.
and salutary and all of those other wonderful things. And hopefully, you know, I say now that we look forward to the day, and hopefully in a few years somebody's going to be looking at this video and saying that makes absolutely no sense. There are dozens of female bishops in the AJC, so I have no idea what they're talking about.
Oh, I was just going to mention that one of my assistants at one point got a email without context that basically said, you know, your sacrament's valid and licit, and I think the response was both perfectly valid and perfectly licit. We of course follow our own rules.
Yeah.
Right. In the sense that you know that there's this thing in the independent movement, and with you know, even with larger, more established churches that aren't a part of you know, the Roman communion, that, you know, there's this constant need to compare ourselves to, like, they're our standard for what's legit or not, but
Yeah.
we're a you know, self-contained autocephalous
Southern Church.
Our sacraments are perfectly valid and perfectly licit.
Yes.
We're not, you know what I mean? It's not, we don't check with them.
That's
to
why
see what-
licitness always has to be in the context. Whose law are you talking about?
Heresy
Exactly.
is in the eye of the beholder.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely right. And heresy is one of these other terms that to stamp someone as a heretic is to presume the authority of some particular set of laws, some particular standard of what constitutes orthodoxy and what constitutes heterodoxy.
Yeah, and a lot of bishops just give that away when they come right out of the gate and say we're valid but illicit.
As soon as